Good evening, boys and girls. It's time to read again from the Jesus Storybook Bible. And this week, we're going to read the story of Moses and the way that God delivered his people from slavery in Egypt. Joseph and his brothers grew old and died, but their children's children stayed on in Egypt, where they became a very large family. Later on, a new king began to rule, but this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph, and he didn't like God's people. He made them into slaves, and he beat them, and he made them work harder and harder. Well, God's people cried out to God to rescue them, and God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham. He would look after his people. He would find a way to set them free. Well, one day, Moses was looking after sheep when something caught his eye. A bush was behaving very oddly. It was flickering with flames, but its leaves weren't burning up. He took a closer look. "Moses!" boomed a big voice. Moses leapt back. The bush was talking to him. "I have heard my people's cries," God said. "I've seen their tears, so I have come down to rescue them. Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go free." Moses was afraid, but God said, "I will be with you." So Moses went to Pharaoh. "Pharaoh," Moses began. "God says." "God?" said Pharaoh. "Never heard of him." Moses kept going. "God says to let his people go free." "Well, why should I?" Pharaoh said. "Don't want to, won't." And so he didn't. So God gave Pharaoh 10 warnings called plagues. First, God turned the river Nile into blood. No one could drink the water, but still Pharaoh would not let them go. So God made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping. In your bed, frogs. In your hair, frogs. In your soup, frogs. All over everywhere, frogs. "Make them go away," Pharaoh screamed. "Then your people can go." So God took away the frogs. But Pharaoh changed his mind. "You can't go," he said. Then God sent zillions of gnats, but still Pharaoh said no. So then God sent swarms of flies, flies buzzing in your eyes, flies. And after that, sickness and horrible boils and huge hailstones and a storm of locusts. Then darkness when it should have been day, until it seemed that the whole world, all of creation and everything, was coming undone, falling back into darkness and emptiness and nothingness. But each time Pharaoh said, "Make it stop and then I'll let them go." And each time, when God made it stop, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, "Actually, no, you can't go." Well, finally, Moses warned Pharaoh, "Obey God, or he will have to send the worst thing of all." And Pharaoh just laughed. So God said, "The oldest boy in each family of Egypt must die, but my people will be safe." God told his people to take their best lamb, to kill it, and to put some of its blood on their front doors. "When God passes over your house," Moses explained, "God will see the blood and know that the lamb died instead of you." That night it was just as God had said. Suddenly, piercing the darkness, echoing down the corridors of the palace, came a blood-curdling scream. Pharaoh's oldest son had died. At last, Pharaoh did what God said. "Get out!" Pharaoh shouted. "Just go!" And so, that very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this great rescue and call it Passover. But an even greater rescue was coming. Many years later, God was going to do it again. He was going to come down once more to rescue his people. But this time, God was going to set them free forever and ever. Moses and God's people escaped out of Egypt and into the wilderness. They didn't know the way, but God knew the way, and he would show them. I will bring you to a new home, a special land, God promised them. I will look after you. I am with you. God sent a big cloud for them to follow, a pillar of smoke stretching up into the sky. It moved in front of them as they walked and shaded them from the blazing heat of the day. And when it was time to rest, it stopped. All through the cold desert nights it kept them warm, glowing like fire. God led his people through the desert to the edge of the great sea. There they were just wondering how to cross it when suddenly they heard a terrible thundering and pounding. It sounded almost like horses' hooves. They shaded their eyes to look back and screamed. It was! Pharaoh and his army were coming to get them. Pharaoh had changed his mind again. "Get my slaves back," he screeched, and charged out into the desert after them, with 600 of his fastest horsemen and every single chariot in Egypt. What were God's people going to do? In front of them was a big sea. It was so big there was no way around it. But there was no way through it. It was too deep. They didn't have any boats, so they couldn't sail across, and they couldn't swim across because it was too far and they would drown. And they couldn't turn back because Pharaoh was chasing them. They could see the flashing swords now, glinting in the baking sun, and the dust clouds, and chariot after scary chariot surging toward them. So they did the only thing that there was left to do: panic. "We're going to die!" they shrieked. "Don't be afraid," Moses said. "But there's nothing we can do," they screamed. "God knows you can't do anything," Moses said. "God will do it for you. Trust him and watch." "But there's no way out," they cried. "God will make a way," Moses said. Another minute and it would have been over. But then the strangest thing happened. God made the pillar of smoke move. It moved behind his people and hid them from the Egyptians. Then God sent a strong east wind to blow all night long. It blew on the water of the big sea. It blew it to the left and it blew it to the right until it blew it into two towering walls of water. And there, right through the middle of the sea, a muddy pathway opened up. And God's people walked across on dry land. When the Egyptians tried to follow, the walls of water crashed back down on them and swallowed them up. God's people were safe. They danced and they laughed and they sang and they thanked God. When there had been no way out, God had made a way. Many years later, once again, God was going to make a way where there was no way. From the beginning, God's children had been running from him and hiding. God knew his children could never be happy without him. But they couldn't get back to him by themselves. They were lost. They didn't know the way back. But God knew the way. And one day, he would show them.